Hello, my name is Savim McCutcheon. I'm a catalog librarian and associate professor at Kent State University in Ohio. My motivations for creating this presentation are multiple. Here at KSU, we needed a way to introduce RDA to new staff people and library school students who work for us. In addition, we're aware that with limited training budgets, there are a lot of catalogers in other libraries, especially public and school libraries, who may have only recently heard of RDA. This presentation is meant for anyone who would like to learn how to recognize and interpret the new kinds of records showing up in our databases. The goal is to equip copy catalogers with the knowledge to find the best matching records for library resources in an environment in which we are transitioning to RDA. I assume that the people watching this have seen lots of bibliographic records while on the job, so you're familiar with the most common marked fields. I don't assume that you have access to the RDA Toolkit, the online product that contains the new instructions. Although this is meant to be a very practical presentation, I'll start with a little theoretical background. The majority of the time, we'll go through what's different between AACR2 and RDA in typical bibliographic records. I'll focus on the what rather than the why. What you're likely to see in bib records, and not so much the reasons behind each feature. I'll show you what RDA records look like to the public in KSU's local catalog. Then I'll talk about the changes to access points you are most likely to encounter. Those are fields under authority control, such as authors, series, and subjects. I'll wrap up by recommending some resources that will give you more information. Let's start with what RDA is. Resource Description and Access is a set of instructions that cover the descriptive cataloging of a record. It also instructs original catalogers in how to set up authorized access points for authors, conference names, and series. We'll concentrate mostly on the descriptive side of things because that's most pertinent to copy cataloging responsibilities. I will be showing examples of bibliographic records using screenshots from OCLC's WorldCat database. I'm using them with OCLC's permission, and this slide shows the verbiage OCLC requests be included in order to do so. At first, when an international committee met to revise Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, 2nd edition, AACR2, they called the revision AACR3. But they changed the name for two reasons. They wanted to emphasize that the new instructions were for everybody, not just for Anglos and Americans. And although RDA is based on AACR2 in some ways, it's pretty different in others, different enough to require and justify a new name. The transition from AACR2 to RDA is the first major change in cataloging instructions in 40 years. It's understandable that any big change can be disconcerting. When you think about how you view RDA right now, it might seem like RDA is frightening and wild. But by the end of this presentation, hopefully RDA will seem tame and manageable. Let's start with just a little theory, then get on to the practical. FRBR is the conceptual model that forms the basis of RDA. It is an entity relationship model. In such a model, an entity is something that can be distinctly defined. Some examples of entities are a work, a person, or an event. A relationship is an association between two entities. Examples are relationships such as produced by, translated by, or created by. FRBR is meant to help users find, identify, select, and obtain the materials they want. The organization of RDA and the RDA Toolkit is based on the organization of FRBR. FRBR categorizes the bibliographic universe into works, expressions, manifestations, and items. A work is a distinct intellectual or artistic creation. It doesn't have a language. It is an abstract idea. It doesn't have a physical form. The same work is unchanged text with illustrations added, translations, abridgments, enlargements, or arrangements of musical works. A new work is created when there is substantial change to the abstract idea, such as in an adaptation for children, a parody, or musical variations on a theme. A film based on a book is a new work. Expression is the intellectual or artistic realization of a work, a version of a work. An expression can be a translation, a particular edition, or an abridged version. Expression is also an abstract idea. Two expressions are the same work when there's only a minor difference between them and the idea behind them isn't changed much. Different expressions include a poem that's written versus a poem that's performed out loud and recorded on a CD, or translations by various translators. Expressions can differ by title, form, date, language, version, or edition. A manifestation is the physical embodiment of an expression of a work. It's a particular publication. It represents all the physical objects that have the same characteristics, both in intellectual content and physical form. Form of carrier is important, like DVD, print, or microfiche. If the form of carrier is different between identical versions of an expression, then it's a different manifestation. Nowadays, we catalog manifestations. For example, copies of a book that all have the same ISBN are likely to be the same manifestation. The ISBN is a manifestation identifier for books. An item is a copy. When we own many copies of a manifestation in a library catalog, we have several physical objects. Each one is represented by an item record which is attached to a bibliographic record. So an item is an individual physical copy. Item identifiers can be barcodes. The most important things to remember from this slide are these: that WEMI stands for Works, Expressions, Manifestations, and Items, and right now it's typically manifestations that we catalog. The ideas of WEMI affect how the RDA toolkit is organized. In RDA, there are different sections devoted to different parts of WEMI: Works, Expressions, Manifestations, and Items. No matter what format you are cataloging, you first think about what you are describing, then read the section and chapters about that task. The organization of the RDA toolkit is very different from the organization of AACR2. In AACR2, each chapter was devoted to a different format. The chapter about books came first, then the chapters on other formats were developed. But you could tell that the chapters for other formats were still book-centric. One of the strengths of RDA is that it's more format-free, a good thing now that we get so many formats and new formats are constantly developing. Here are some reasons why FRBR is important. FRBR should make these user tasks easier: find, identify, select, and obtain. And increased identification of relationships gives better information to users and gives flexibility in manipulating data. In a catalog based on FRBR concepts, when we create any expression or manifestation level record, the subject headings, summary, and call number would already be there in the work record. It would save a lot of time of the catalogers to make a new manifestation record if they used a nice full work level record as the basis for it. Doing so would also increase consistency among bibliographic records. FRBR is best realized in an entity relationship database structure rather than the flat file structure of MARC. You may have heard that the Library of Congress is working on a replacement for MARC. This is called the Bibliographic Framework Transition Initiative, or BibFrame for short. In this presentation, I am explaining only the basics of FRBR. For more information, I highly recommend these two titles. The first is freely available on the web and gives a good overview. The other is a book that goes more in depth. So what is RDA? It is a set of instructions to guide the description of resources and also the formation of access points. It is based on AACR2, so if you're already familiar with AACR2 records and how they look, the time it takes to learn RDA might be shorter than if you are new to both. In the OCLC WorldCat database, there are many thousands of RDA records already. We'll be seeing a mix of different types of records for many years into the future. At Kent State University, we have been actively preparing ourselves for RDA since 2009. We've received and accepted copy cataloging in RDA since 2011. In January 2013, we began original cataloging in most formats in RDA. At that time, we also began creating authority records in RDA. We switched to doing all original cataloging in RDA at the same time as the Library of Congress, March 31st, 2013. One thing to remember is that RDA records are compatible with AACR2 records. It is not necessary to go back and convert or recatalog AACR2 records to RDA. Even so, in OCLC's WorldCat database, it is permitted, even encouraged, to add RDA features to AACR2 records. AACR records which have had some RDA features added are called hybrid records. OCLC plans to add certain RDA features to AACR records within the next few years to make them consistent. This consistency may help in a transition away from MARC and into a new bibliographic framework. There are some new terms in RDA for familiar AACR concepts. Here are some of them. I will be using the new terms as much as possible during this presentation. For example, what used to be called the chief source of information in AACR2, which often meant the title page of a book or title frames of a video recording, that's called the preferred source of information in RDA. And RDA has a broader definition. The preferred source of information is anywhere on the resource. Two main principles of RDA are to write down what you see and to accept what is provided. Thus we will see fewer abbreviations and fuller information in some fields. Compared to AACR2, RDA offers catalogers more options. Often, there's more than one way to do things right. Where there's more than one correct choice, the Library of Congress and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging have written down in the RDA Toolkit their policy statements. Here at KSU, we plan to follow the Library of Congress and Program for Cooperative Cataloging policy statements, the LC-PCC PSs, unless there's a really good reason not to. And then we'll document the exception to aid our future catalogers. Whatever you do on a local, consortial, or national level, it's good to document and advertise your decisions. Now let's get to what you've been waiting for. Let's look at some actual RDA records. This is a screenshot from the OCLC WorldCat database of an RDA record. The 040 field is primarily used to show the codes for institutions that had a hand in creating or editing a master record. Here you see that DLC, which stands for the Library of Congress, is the first institution to have worked on this record. In addition, the 040 field has a few subfields with other meanings. The subfield E with the abbreviation RDA is your red flag that this is an RDA record. All RDA records should have in the 040 field a subfield E with RDA. In addition to RDA in that subfield, in the fixed field portion of the record, in the descriptive cataloging form area, there's the code I. We're used to seeing AACR2 records that say A for AACR2. Here we'll see other codes. I means that the record has the descriptive cataloging and punctuation conventions of ISBD, International Standard Bibliographic Description, but is known to be a non-AACR2 record. In other words, it has the punctuation like slashes and colons between elements that we know and love, but it's something besides an AACR2 record. It's possible to see other codes in the descriptive cataloging form area as well, like a blank or a C, but most often in RDA records, we see a description code of I. I'd like to draw your attention to another aspect of this record, even though it isn't directly related to RDA. Notice how the code ENG shows up twice. Each occurrence has a different meaning. On the top right, in the fixed field, the language code ENG means that this resource is written in English. In the 040 field, the subfield B shows the language of cataloging. The OCLC WorldCat database is international, with libraries all over the world creating records in it. The 040 subfield B with the code ENG means that this record was created by an English language library for an English-speaking audience. Other records for English language resources could have 040 subfield B codes for FRE for French or GER for German. In those cases, notes and subject headings in the record might be in a different language because the records are meant for audiences whose primary language is not English. It's best to use only records that are in the language of cataloging of your audience. For Americans, ENG in the 040 subfield B. If you see a record with no language code in the 040 subfield B, the language of cataloging is assumed to be English, so that is acceptable also. In other words, for English-speaking patrons, the best records to choose are those with the 040 subfield E of English, but the language code in the top right in the fixed field could vary to match whatever the language of the resource itself is. In both the OCLC browser and client interfaces, it's possible to limit all searches to your language of cataloging. If you'd like assistance with this, just contact me. Now let's look at some common differences in the body of records between AACR2 and RDA. The default for capitalization in RDA is to use an in-house style manual, like the Chicago Manual of Style, and the result can be capitalization just as it is now in AACR2, like the example on the left. However, there's an option in RDA to capitalize as you see it, and also to accept however a vendor renders the record. For example, if a vendor created a record from an automated process, and that process input the title in all capital letters, then it would save time for the cataloger to accept the record as is, capital letters included. So just don't be surprised if you see more capitalization. In RDA records, you might see some additional information in the Statement of Responsibility, the 245 subfield C, as well. If the title page says it's written by Dr. Margaret and Reverend James Stutley from the University of Honolulu, you may very well see those words in the Statement of Responsibility. See how the Latin abbreviations are gone when you don't know where or by whom something is published. Instead, you write out place of publication not identified and publisher not identified. And for those times when the cataloger knows information, but it doesn't come from the preferred source of information, the elements each get their own set of brackets instead of one long one. As I mentioned earlier, many abbreviations are eliminated. I consider this a good thing because a lot of abbreviations came from Latin and were pretty cryptic at first glance. Now, catalog users will see things in their own language. However, standards of measurement are staying as abbreviations, including cm for centimeters. It's actually considered a symbol rather than an abbreviation. In a few places in records, periods are used in ways that aren't intuitive. Don't worry too much about whether there should or shouldn't be a period at the end of cm. It doesn't affect patron access. Just realize that there may be some variation among records depending on whether there's a series or not. In AACR, there are a couple different ways to indicate that a misspelling is really on the source, using either a Latin abbreviation to show it's truly the publisher's error and not the cataloger's error, or by putting IE and the correct word in brackets. In RDA, you transcribe what you see, even if it contains a misspelling, and you provide the corrected version in another field. This is the way it is done for all formats, with the exception of misspellings in the title of serials and integrating resources. AACR had us change certain marks of punctuation when they were found on the preferred source of information. However, RDA instructs us to transcribe punctuation as it appears on the source. A parallel title is a title in a different language that means the same thing as your main title. We often see parallel titles on bilingual dictionaries. In bibliographic records, parallel titles are connected with an equal sign. AACR2 told us to transcribe parallel titles from the chief source of information, which is usually the title page. In RDA, we can take a parallel title from anywhere on the resource. If that parallel title comes from a different source than the title proper, we have the option of stating that location in a note. Additionally, there is no limit in RDA as to how many parallel titles you can record. RDA is more relaxed about where we get information. As long as it's in the resource we have, it's okay. If it comes from outside the resource, then we use brackets. This is a big change. The rule limiting us to listing 3 or fewer authors is gone. I don't know if you're familiar with the AACR2 rule of 3. Basically, it told us to list up to 3 authors, but if we had 4 or more, we should omit all but the first and treat the information like you see on the left side of the slide. I'd like to point out 3 different things here. 1. RDA gets rid of Latin abbreviations, so when there are more than 3 authors, we no longer list one, then use the Latin abbreviation et al. Instead, you can list all the authors that appear on your preferred source of information. Also, the first author now goes in a 100 instead of a sub-100 field. That is, the first author gets a preferred access point instead of an added access point. And 3, it's only required that the first named author gets credit. That is, the first author is in the 100 field, but none of the additional authors have to be placed in 700 fields. It's optional. Another option under RDA is to replace et al. With brackets, then write in brackets and however many others. Note, however, that the policy statement says generally do not omit names in a statement of responsibility. The method shown on the previous slide is preferred. Even if the other authors aren't listed in the body of the record, it is okay to give them credit in 700s. As you can see with the rule of 3 examples, in RDA we give up some consistency and in exchange we get some flexibility. RDA says that if a noun or noun phrase occurs with a statement of responsibility, treat the noun or noun phrase as part of the statement of responsibility. Also, in case of doubt, treat the noun or noun phrase as part of the statement of responsibility. In other words, the word by makes a difference in what goes into the title field statement of responsibility, the 245 subfield C. This means that in RDA records, you may see phrases that look like subtitles in the statement of responsibility instead. Words that used to go in the 245 subfield B might now go in the 245 subfield C instead. It just depends on whether the phrases are grammatically linked. When you see an addition statement, write down what you see. If it's spelled out in words, then transcribe the words. If it is already abbreviated on your resource, then transcribe the abbreviation. On the RDA side of the screen, note the second period after ED. This is technically right, according to RDA and ISBD. Frankly, I expect a lot of errors with the extra period getting left out. Happily, if it is left out, it's just a minor error. It doesn't affect access. Personally, I am more concerned with major errors, those that make it difficult for users to find, identify, select, and obtain resources. This is a more important change. In early RDA records, from 2010 to mid-2012, all kinds of publication-related information was recorded in the 260 field because there wasn't an alternative. Now, however, all new and newly upgraded RDA records should use the 264 field instead. It provides more granularity, a better breakdown of information. The first indicator is used to show changes in production, publication, distribution, and manufacture elements for multi-volume monographs, serials, and integrating resources. What we'll see more often, though, are 264s with varying second indicators. These can come in useful. The second indicator tells us what kind of function the corporate body performed: production, publication, distribution, or manufacture. There's also an indicator specifically for copyright date. The two we'll see most often are second indicator 1 for publication information and second indicator 4 for copyright information. Let's take a look at some examples. Here's an RDA record showing several features we've talked about so far. In the 040, there's a subfield E with the code RDA. In the fixed field, for descriptive cataloging form, there's a letter I. In the 260 field, there are two dates. The first, 2010, is a date of publication. This must have appeared on the resource because it's not in brackets. In addition, there's a copyright date of 2010. Note that for copyright information, the actual copyright symbol is used instead of the letter C to represent copyright. Because there are two dates instead of one, and the two dates mean different things, a few elements related to dates in the fixed field change as well. In AACR2 in this situation, we'd have recorded just the publication date and left it at that. So under AACR2, the date type would be S for single. In RDA, with both publication date and a copyright date, we use date type T, which means there are both publication and copyright dates following in the dates area. Here's an example of an RDA record with the date of publication 2013 and the copyright date of 2012. It has two separate 264 fields. The 264 with the second indicator 1 shows publication information and publication date. The 264 with the second indicator 4 has a subfield C, then the copyright date. Up in the fixed field, the date type is T, meaning that what follows in the dates areas will first be a publication date and then a copyright date. Here's another correct way to input information. There's only one 264 field here for publishing information, and the date of publication is in brackets, meaning it didn't show up that way on the resource. It's probable that instead there was just a copyright date of 2013, and the cataloger made an educated guess that the publication date was the same as the copyright date. So to save some typing, the cataloger made just one 264 field, including the inferred date of publication, and omitted a second 264 field containing the copyright date. Then, because there's just one single date in the descriptive portion of the record, the date type in the fixed field is S for single date. On the plus side, doing it this way, there's less typing for the cataloger, so it saves time. The small downside is that the information is a little less granular or precise. The person looking at the record can't tell for certain where the bracketed 2013 came from. It might have been inferred from the copyright date or might have come from somewhere else. AACR2 gave rather complicated instructions about what to do when there are multiple places of publication listed. Always, the cataloger gave the first place listed. Then the results changed based on the home country of the cataloger. If the first place was in the country of the cataloger, the 260 subfield A was finished. If the first place was a different country, but some later place listed was in the same country as the cataloger, then the cataloger included that additional place also. But the cataloger omitted all the other places listed in between the first place and the place in the country of the cataloger. See? It's rather complicated in AACR2. In RDA, it's simpler. We record either all the places of publication, distribution, etc., or only the first one. AACR2 says to use abbreviations from Appendix B for certain pieces of information. In RDA, We generally don't abbreviate unless the abbreviation appears on the piece. Note here that Pennsylvania is spelled out, and so is department, because that's the way it appears on the resource. When catalogers can estimate a date of publication, they should do so in both AACR2 and RDA. AACR2 tells us that between dates should be fewer than 20 years apart. In RDA, we can have between dates spanning any number of years. And RDA tells us that when the date of publication is not identified in a single part resource, supply the date or approximate date of publication. Because we now have so many options for conveying estimated dates, most catalogers will estimate. The other option would be to put in brackets, date of publication not identified, but nowadays with RDA, it should be a last resort. The physical description in RDA is similar to what we are used to. However, abbreviations are spelled out. Note that some catalogers will use the British spelling of color, COLOUR. Although I consider periods a minor matter, I'd like to show you an example of what we talked about in a previous slide. Here's an example of a 300 field followed by a series. So the CM in the 300 field has a period after it. And an example of a 300 with no series, so there's no period after the CM. Now I'll explain a more important difference. GMD stands for General Material Designation. It indicates format. Even if you don't recognize the abbreviation, you've probably seen GMDs. They are words describing formats in brackets in the middle of title fields. Examples are video recording, sound recording, and electronic resource. In AACR2, they exist in any bibliographic record for non-print or audiovisual resources. A big change, especially for those of us who work with non-print or audiovisual material, is that in RDA there is no GMD. It's replaced by three fields, the 336 for content type, 337 for media type, and 338 for carrier type. Content has to do with what something is and what human sense is needed to use it. Text is a book or serial. Performed music is a sound recording of music. Notated music is a score. Spoken word is a sound recording of a book. Two-dimensional moving image is a video recording. And three-dimensional form could be a globe, a toy, etc. Media type has to do with what equipment is needed to access the content in the resource. Examples are audio, used for sound recordings. Computer is used for electronic resources. Microform is used for things that require a microfiche or microfilm reader. Projected is used for motion pictures or slides, things that are projected. Unmediated is used for things that can be perceived directly without a machine, like print books and serials. And video is used for things that require a videocassette player or a DVD player. The 338 for carrier type has to do with what something is housed in. Examples are audio cassette, audio disc, computer disc, online resource, microfiche, film reel, card, flip chart, volume, videocassette, and video disc. Here's what a GMD looks like in AACR and what the content, media, and carrier fields look like in a DVD record made under RDA. One of the decisions for us to make as a library community is how much and what portion of the 336 through 338 fields to show to the public. What would be helpful to them? We could choose to display some of the elements and not others. Part of the answer lies in how our system will handle these fields. Ideally, vendors would use the information in the 33X fields to generate user-friendly icons or natural language alternatives for the public. However, vendors haven't created icons or natural language alternatives yet. Later in the presentation, I'll show you examples of how KSU is displaying and labeling these fields for the public. Here are the standard content, media, and carrier types for a book: text, unmediated, volume. Here's an example of a print serial. Print books and print serials have the same contents in the 336, 337, and 338 fields. That is, the content type, the 336, is text. Optionally, it's followed by a subfield B containing a code that means text. Then it's followed by a subfield 2 specifying that this is RDA content. The media type, the 337, is unmediated because no equipment is necessary to help a person use the resource. There's an optional subfield B with a code meaning unmediated, then the subfield 2 for RDA media. The carrier type, the 338, is volume. It has an optional code meaning volume in the subfield B, and then the subfield 2 for RDA carrier. The important thing to remember is that the 336, 337, and 338 combination for a print book or print serial is text, unmediated, volume. Here's a sound recording on a CD. The 336 or content type is performed music. The 337 or media type is audio. The 338 or carrier type is audio disc. Here's a short exercise. How is this record different from an AACR2 record? In the 100 field, there is a subfield E with author. This is a relationship designator. In 245, there's the placement of the subfield C. Instead of being in subfield B, a novel occurs in subfield C. In the 250, first edition is spelled out. Regarding the 260, this is a little tricky. CO for Colorado is the postal code instead of the AACR2 abbreviation. CO must have appeared this way on the book, and so it was transcribed. In subfield B, AACR says to shorten the form of the publisher's name to the shortest form that's still internationally recognizable. So in AACR2, we could use just David C. Cook without the word publisher. But in RDA, we're to transcribe what we see without putting in extra things or taking things out, so publisher remains. Also, the publication date followed by the copyright date with the copyright symbol is here. Note that this is the old way of inputting publisher information. The new way is to use 264 fields. In the 300 field, pages is spelled out, and there's no period at the end of CM because there's no series. Then, of course, there are 336, 337, and 338 fields. I don't want to overwhelm you, but I just want to inform you that there are some new fields available for catalogers to use, mostly for audiovisual material. You may find useful pieces of information in new fields instead of, or in addition to, finding those pieces of information in more familiar fields. There are more new fields for use in RDA. This is just a taste. If you are interested, you can read more about them at the websites listed here. The main thing to remember is that some information in a bibliographic record might show up in a field that's new to you. AACR2 tells us to abbreviate words and numerals, as in appendices B and C for series. RDA tells us to transcribe the words we see, and the LC-PCC PS tells us that this means Roman numerals also. So in the 490 field, a transcription field, we transcribe pretty much what we see. But remember that when it comes to series, the 490 is only half the story. Each 490 gives us what was seen on the piece. Then if it's traced, it's paired with an 8XX field, typically an 830. That 830 shows us the authorized form of the series. In the 830, we'll continue to use the instructions as given in series authority records for numbering. One of the strengths of RDA is how much emphasis is placed on recording relationships. Typically in an RDA record, each person and corporate body will have a subfield E after it with a relationship designator. In this record, you can see subfield E relationship designators for the film director, screenwriters, actors, and the production company. There's an additional interesting relationship to look at. Up at the top of the screen, there's a note saying that this movie was based on a book. In order to give people access to the book, there's an access point, a 700 field, showing the author of the book and the title of the book, just like we would have in AACR2. The difference is that in RDA, we include a phrase in subfield I of that 700 field, explaining the relationship between the movie and the book. In this case, we have a motion picture adaptation of a work. So far, we've explored the most common differences in bibliographic records. Although we focused mainly on books, the differences I explained are applicable to all formats. Now I'm going to get into less common differences, ones that a copy cataloger is less likely to see on a regular basis. If you don't find these applicable to your work, feel free to skim them or skip to the section on RDA and public view. Although the instructions in RDA are meant to cover all formats, there are a few exceptions based on format. When you have a year at the beginning of a serial title, you omit it under both AACR2 and RDA. The difference is, in RDA, you use marks of omission, ... Even though we transcribe what we see, including misspellings and other formats, serials need an exception. Serials are describing many issues, not just one. If the issue with the misspelling is used for the title in the bib record, it would make it awfully hard for a catalog user to find what he's looking for. When the nature of a resource is unclear from the title, in AACR2 we could supply other title information in brackets for any format. In RDA, we are only allowed to supply other title information in brackets for cartographic resources, like maps and globes, and moving image resources, like video recordings. For other formats, we should use a note instead. This situation doesn't come up very often, but it's worth mentioning. Sometimes you get a book with a bunch of stories, and in lieu of having one title drawing them all together, the book just lists the stories and authors one after another. This is a resource with no collective title. Most frequently, we see this with sound recordings, but it can occur in other formats as well. I've provided the wording of the RDA instruction for resources lacking collective title. Let's see what a bib record looks like when the instruction is applied. The slide here is awfully dense, but it gives you some idea of how it's done differently from AACR2 to RDA. The main difference is that in RDA, there is no 100 field or preferred access point for the first composer, nor a 240 for uniform title. Instead, those pieces of information go into 700 field, a regular access point. There is an option for the cataloger to devise a collective title, but it is discouraged by the LC-PCC PS. The main thing for copy catalogers to remember is that when there's no collective title, all the titles and authors are still listed, just in different parts of the record. Okay, here's a gratuitous picture of my puppies. This slide is just to give your brains and eyes a quick break and to introduce a new topic. There are several fields new to RDA that require libraries to make display and/or labeling decisions. Two sets of fields that need to be addressed are the 264 and the 33X. What new fields and what portion of those fields should display to the public? And when the public user of the catalog encounters those fields, what should the fields be called? Ideally, vendors would make icons or natural language alternatives for the various combinations of 336, 337, and 338 fields, but they haven't yet. So in the meantime, we have to do the best we can for our public with what we have to work with. At Kent State University Libraries, the members of the cataloging committee consulted with public services personnel as much as possible about what to show to the public. After seeing common combinations of terms used in the 33X fields, it was an easy decision to suppress the 337 from public view. The terms in the 337 are pretty general and duplicate the root words of the 338. We also suppressed subfields within each 33X field that just have no meaning for the end users, like subfield 2, RDA content. Note that we don't get rid of any fields or subfields. They are retained in the bibliographic records for future use. Selected ones just don't show to the public. So here's what cataloger users see when they come across an RDA record in our local catalog, KentLink. This is a record for a book. Information from the 264 field for publication and the second 264 field for copyright date are placed on separate lines. For the content type, 336, and carrier type, 338, at first we catalogers proposed to public services folks that we use the default labels and terms for the public, which would give us two lines with content, text, then carrier, volume. But they said that when they heard carrier, they thought of airlines and cell phone companies, and it just wouldn't do. I like their suggestion better, to have one line called format and to list the 336 and 338 terms one after another in it. Here's a record for an electronic book. And a score with an interesting set of publication, distribution, and copyright data. We're in the home stretch. We're coming upon the promised whirlwind tour of access points. We've talked a lot about the descriptive portions of a record. Now we're going to shift gears and talk a little about access points, the parts of a record that fall under authority control, like author, series, and subjects. These typically have authority records to show the standard wording we should use regardless of what record we're in or what terms the author used. I realize that it's mostly copy catalogers. You don't have a need to create authorized access points, so this section is FYI. I just want to inform you of the most significant changes happening to authority records so you'll recognize them when you see them. As mentioned before, in 1XX and 7XX fields in RDA, it's encouraged to use relationship designators after the authorized term, such as author or editor of compilation. Some programs, such as the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, require their library participants to include relationship designators, so you will see a lot of them. Some RDA instructions will affect authority records. Keeping with the RDA practice of eliminating abbreviations, OT for Old Testament and NT for New Testament will be spelled out. Under AACR2, authority records for individual books of the Bible included OT or NT. Now they will omit those terms in between. The abbreviation DEPT will now be spelled out when it is spelled out on the resource. To avoid inconsistency in split files, the Library of Congress and OCLC made global changes to these headings when RDA was adopted. Here are examples of parts of the Bible as input under AACR2 and then RDA. And RDA instructions affect the transliteration of the word Quran also. This is my favorite change in RDA. It will probably make children's librarians very happy. When it seems like a living animal or fictitious character wrote a book, now, bibliographically, we can describe the book as though the animal or fictitious character actually wrote the book. I believe this makes it easier for users of the catalog, especially children, to find a resource that they believe is really written by their favorite character. Another aspect of RDA we can be happy about is this. When a person is known as senior, junior, the third, or some other term that conveys similar meaning in other languages, we include them in the access point for the person. So the access point for the famous American country singer Hank Williams Jr. can be exactly what people expect it to be. For the first time, families can be considered creators and contributors to a resource. I think this will be very useful for librarians who catalog genealogies and family histories compiled by more than one person in a family. However, these types of access points should not be used as subject headings. There will be separate authority records for families as creators and families as subjects. AACR2 told us to omit certain pieces of information in a conference authority record, such as frequency or years of convocation, as well as the location and date if those pieces of information are integral parts of the name. RDA has us add more information to authority records for a conference. Here's an RDA authority record for the person best known as Hank Williams Jr. And guess what? You can tell it's an RDA authority record the same way you can tell that something's an RDA bib record, by the subfield E that says RDA in the 040 field. And if you've ever looked at an AACR2 authority record, you can see that RDA authority records give more information. Instead of a brief listing, just enough to disambiguate people with the same name, RDA authority records can give a mini biography. I'd like to recommend some resources for additional reading. The first is OCLC's most recent RDA Policy Statement. Because Kent State University is a member of OCLC, OCLC policy statements and discussion papers influence our local decisions. We want to follow international standards as much as possible, and we discuss the implications of OCLC's decisions at our cataloging committee meetings. One of note is that OCLC plans to add RDA features like 33X fields to AACR2 records, and in 2016, OCLC plans to remove GMDs, even in our AACR2 records, so it's the wave of the future. The third is a book that truly is a guide to the basics. A few things have changed since it was published in 2010, such as the new 264 field, but it's still a very good introduction. KSU's website was created for internal use on an intranet, so it's a little rough, but I share it here to give you an example of what a library can do to collect and create training tools for RDA. It contains PowerPoints of in-house presentations my colleagues and I gave to our staff and technical services, among other things. It also contains a document called Monographs Copy Cataloging, Fields to Check, RDA, that is a handy checklist of what to look for when searching for a matching bib record. Adam Schiff has done presentations in which he compares AACR2 and RDA. His presentations are more detailed than this one. I strove to explain the most common differences between AACR2 and RDA. Adam strives to cover all the changes comprehensively. I have benefited greatly from his presentations for both description and access, and got ideas for this presentation from his. If you want to get deep in the weeds, the Library of Congress's Catalogers Learning Workshop provides a lot of information. Here are good sources of information about changes from AACR2, the JSC, or Joint Steering Committee, website, RDA and MARC, and certain OCLC technical bulletins. I hope that now that you've had some exposure to common differences between AACR2 and RDA, RDA will seem tame and manageable. Yes, it's different, but the differences are fairly modest in most records. So have fun with RDA, and if I can be of additional assistance, don't hesitate to contact me. I would be delighted to receive feedback or to answer any additional questions you might have. Thank you for your time and attention.